Over the past few weeks, I've been throwing larger batches of 3 different shapes of bowls. They've all been thrown from the same weight of clay, 1 pound, or 453 grams. The first bowls made were those I'm most comfortable with. It's a shape I've been making for years. Then there's this middle variant, with an indent around the top. The curve and foot ring are almost identical to the first bowl, but the groove around the top creates a lovely area from which to hold the bowl from, and with any luck it should interact nicely with my glazes. And lastly there's the deeper variant, more suited perhaps for soup or cereal, and a very necessary addition to my repertoire of pots, I think. This video though is about throwing and trimming the bowl in the middle. To begin the process, my first initial bowl is only rough, and my only aim really is to throw it to dimensions I'm happy with. Sometimes the pot makes it, and sometimes it doesn't, but as long as I'm able to accurately measure it and set my throwing gauge's pointer, then that's all that matters. And here's what the rough shape I'll be aiming for looks like. Once the bowl's been thrown, I adjust my throwing gauge so that the pointer of it rests just beside the rim of the pot. I then secure the arm really tightly, and once the arm is exactly set to where I want it, I'll flip the point up and down a couple of times, just so I make sure the rubber pointer falls in the same spot each time. I then simply use a ruler to measure the piece, both the width and height, and then I just make a rough note of the pot shape, the dimensions, and the thrown weight, which a little later I'll draw up more neatly in my proper notebook. All of these bowls are thrown from a pound of clay, and at the end of this video I'll show you how much they weigh once trimmed, and again once they've turned completely bone dry and all the moisture has left them, the results of which were a lot more dramatic than I thought they might be. I then slice under this first pot, lift it away and place it at the front of the wearboard, and now I have that physical point set in space. I can begin to throw with a lot more speed and a lot more accuracy too, as my goal throughout this process is to make the bowls as identical as they can possibly be to each other, and I really can't underestimate how important the throwing gauge is for this. The tip of the rubber pointer gives me a place to aim for, and as it's retractable, I can flick it up when doing things like centering and wiring off the pot. Then when I'm ready, I just flip it down and my target's set. And for those of you who wonder where I get my throwing gauges from, they're made by my good friend and potter, Darren Ellis, and I'll leave a link to the pointers in the description below. I use soft clay for these, which makes the centering and the pulling up of the walls incredibly easy, but it also means that the clay has less strength, so I can't fuss around when making these. I have to be quick and to the point. As I throw these, I'm making sure that the base itself is left to be about 1 centimetre or 1.5 centimetres thick. That way, when it comes to trim them, there's enough clay in the bottom of these in order to turn a nice tall and elegant foot. Equally, it means there's enough clay in the base that I can push my fingers into some of that excess in order to lift the pot away from the wheel from, which means I don't need to use throwing bats. Once the rough shape is there, I use a curved metal kidney and push it into the rim section. I don't worry too much if they aren't perfect from bowl to bowl, as I will be able to trim that curve once the pot's leather hard. I then use a blunted metal turning tool to scrape away the excess around the base, and that's one step I always do before refining the inside like this, as removing the clay around the foot can occasionally cause the interior form to distort, so by smoothing the inside walls afterwards, I always ensure that they're nice and curved. I then drape a soaked chamois leather over the rim, which softens that edge to a nice point. The twisted metal wire is then dragged underneath the pot, and then I carry the pot away, using 2 fingers from each hand and spinning the wheel at the exact moment I lift the vessel, which helps to break the tacky seal between the pot and the pad of clay left on the wheel. And then I spent the next hour or so throwing a few more boards of these pots. Repetition throwing isn't a process that bores me, which is something you might have gathered now if you've been watching my channel for a while. I love the challenge of repetition throwing, trying my hardest to ensure that not only the forms are all the same, but the weight distribution and the strength of the rim are all the same too. I've actually made a video in the past that goes over my 5 tips for repetition throwing, and for those interested, I'll leave a link to the video on screen now and in the description below too. All these freshly thrown pots will now sit overnight and slowly dry out to a state we call leather hard. At this point, the pots can be picked up and handled without them simply being destroyed as you do so. Much of the moisture has left the pots, and they do sort of feel like hard leather. Making sure that the pots are at the perfect condition before you trim them is critical, and it's something learned through trial and error, really. If you attempt to trim pots when they're too soft, they tend to deform, and the turnings that are removed simply stick themselves back to the pot and onto your tool, and the whole process just becomes a mess. On the other hand, if you try and trim pots when they're too firm, it becomes a real bore, and it can be painful too. The clay only comes off in small dry shards, and you end up having to apply so much pressure with the tool that your wrist can be in agony after a trimming session, and what you really want is the clay to be somewhere between those 2 points. I actually ended up trimming these bowls a few days later, so I kept them wrapped up tightly for this period. Each bowl is then placed back onto the wheel head, and I tap center it. Then, as I want to trim the rim section first, I keep the pot held down with this plastic spinner on top, which I push down through very firmly as I trim this indent around the rim. As the glazes I use will pool in this area, softening the curve, I trim it to be a bit more exaggerated than I intended initially. That way this groove is still present once filled with molten glass. I then position 3 lumps of soft clay around the rim which hold the bowl firmly in place so I can trim the underside of the pot. These lugs are pushed down firmly, but I make sure that I don't push them directly into the bowl itself, as doing so could deform the delicate rim, so instead they're just pushed directly downward, and I let the excess that's squeezed into the bowl be the clay that holds it. I then score a line on the base with a pair of measured calipers, and then the trimming can really begin. And you know when your clay is in the right state, when it peels off in lovely long ribbons like this, instead of immediately clinging back onto the bowl or getting stuck on the tool itself. At this point I'm dividing the underside into 2 sections. There are the curved walls of the bowl, and then there's the foot ring. Once I've roughly carved away enough clay from each, I'll begin to refine them, and I usually begin with the foot ring, trimming a nice straight line down from where I scored in that mark on the top of the foot at the beginning, and I then trim the walls so that they flow nicely into that corner the 2 parts create. And after a final bit of shaping, I can begin to turn the foot itself. I switch to a finer trimming tool for this, and trim the straight foot so that it has 2 distinct angles on it, the innermost of which creates a nice groove. This indent, with any luck, should catch the molten glaze as it flows down the outside curve of the bowl during the firing. It's also a lovely nook to hold the pot from. I like the elegance the tool foot ring provides, and in terms of functionality, it raises the contents up above what could be a cold surface it's placed onto, keeping the food inside warmer for longer. I try to keep this style of foot consistent throughout my work, which means that most of the bowl forms I make will have a foot that more or less looks a bit like this. It's the proportions that tend to change. Sometimes they're wider or taller, but typically they always have the same 2 facets, like this. And now that the outer walls and the foot ring are refined, I can begin to hollow out the thick expanse of clay that remains inside the foot. I gouge the clay out, always starting with my tool in the middle and working my way out. I do this task bit by bit and really carefully, as all it takes is one slip to accidentally cut into the outside portion of the foot, which needs to remain intact. So it's probably at this stage, more than any other throughout this process, where I'm being the most careful and I'm trying to keep the tool as steady and still as possible as I turn. If the foot of this bowl was a clock, I always begin my trimming in the middle, and then I drag the tool horizontally towards 3 o'clock. And that's typically the line I work on. I don't want it to be dragged around any further towards the top, towards 1 or 2 o'clock, nor do I want to be trimming too far back, let's say 5 or 6 o'clock. This is the general area you should work in, if you make pots on a wheel that spins anti-clockwise. And as I trim, I occasionally check the thickness just by pushing down gently with the tip of my thumb. And if I feel the base of the bowl bow inwards just a little bit, it means it's usually time to stop. I then make sure the top of the foot ring is flat and burnish those sharp edges with the tips of my fingers. I then stamp my maker's mark into the foot. The size of this one was specifically made to stamp the medium bowls I make. And then I just tidy up this edge again as pushing the stamp in does displace a tiny amount of clay upward, and if not removed, it would leave a permanent bump on the foot. That's one bowl finished, 41 more to go. And whilst that may seem like a lot, the task doesn't take long. Trimming is always a task I look forward to, especially when combined with a new shape, as I always enjoy figuring out the best way of turning a new form. Not only that, but getting lost in the process every now and then is quite nice too. I'm often asked whether I listen to music or whether I always work in silence, the answer to which is that I only make in silence when the camera is rolling. Otherwise I listen to music, audiobooks or podcasts as I make. And as the wheel tray fills up with trimmings, every now and then I have to empty it, scooping them into the reclaim bucket that sits directly to the left of my wheel, although usually after trimming this many bowls, the floor around the wheel gets flooded with them too. I thought this would be interesting to include. Here's a thrown untrimmed bowl, which weighs just under 400 grams, and now I'll weigh a turned one, which comes to 190 grams, which is 200 grams less than the original thrown piece, and finally a bone dry version, which is when all the moisture has left the piece, which comes to 167 grams, a huge difference compared to the original thrown weight of 453 grams, or 1 pound of clay. Hopefully that gives you a good idea of how thin these are. I could probably make them with less, but the extra clay is needed in order to have a tall footring. Truth be told, I'd rather throw them very quickly, even if they are a bit thick, as opposed to spending more time throwing each one to be very thin, which in all likelihood would make them more susceptible to warping, and I'd have to make them on throwing bats. So there's just a few pros and cons for you. Anyway, the route you take to get to the final product doesn't really matter, as long as they're beautiful and well crafted. I'm really happy with these bowls, and I can't wait to get them coated in glaze and reduction fired soon. That's all for this week. Thanks so much for watching, as always. I can't quite believe the channel has surpassed 800,000 subscribers now, which is just a ludicrous number, so thank you to everyone who's taken the time to subscribe. It really means a lot, and I'll see you next week.